Sergeant Lena Vasquez stepped off the transport shuttle and into the wide silver corridor of Station Helix 9, with nothing but a duffel bag over her shoulder and a grin on her face that made every alien in the hallway take one step back. She was not tall by human standards, and she was not particularly large, but she walked like someone who had never once considered the possibility that the universe might kill her today. And even if it did, she would probably find the whole thing funny. The station was enormous, and it hummed with the quiet noise of 1,000 species living and training, and trying very hard not to eat each other, or run away from each other, depending on which end of the food chain they came from. Helix 9 was home to the Galactic Union Joint Military Academy, and it was supposed to be the place where the galaxy learned to work together. And it mostly worked, except for the part where it absolutely did not work at all. Ride over, and the file was not encouraging. Her predecessor had lasted 4 months before a Vraxi cadet had puffed up his neck frills during a training exercise and accidentally triggered a stampede among the prey species cadets, and 3 Telhari had ended up in the medical bay with broken wings, and the instructor had submitted his resignation from inside a supply closet where he had locked himself and refused to come out. Lena had laughed when she read that part, and the officer sitting next to her on the shuttle had given her a very concerned look. Now she stood in the corridor outside Training Hall 7, and she looked at the door, and she took a breath, and she walked in. 12 cadets sat in a rough semicircle, and every single one of them looked miserable. On the left side sat the predator species, and they were trying very hard to look tough. And on the right side sat the prey species, and they were trying very hard to look invisible. And in the middle was a semical, gap wide enough to land a shuttle in. Lena dropped her bag on the floor, and the sound echoed, and 12 heads turned toward her, and 12 pairs of eyes, or more in some cases, studied the small soft creature who had just walked into their lives. "My name is Sergeant Lena Vasquez," she said, and she smiled, and she watched 4 cadets flinch at the sight of her teeth. "I am a human from Earth, and I am your new integration instructor, and I am very happy to meet all of you." Nobody said anything. A tall Vraxi male in the back row made a low rumbling sound in his throat that Lena recognized from the cultural briefing as a dominance challenge, and his bronze scales caught the light as he straightened to his full height, which was impressive. "That is a very nice sound," Lena said to him. "What is your name?" The Vraxi blinked his amber eyes twice, which meant he was confused. "I am Cadet Rule Tarn," he said. "Rule," Lena said. "Excellent name, and excellent posture. But you are going to have to try harder than that, because I once stared down a grizzly bear in the mountains of Montana, and it blinked first." She had no idea if that story was true, because it was her grandmother who told it, and her grandmother was a magnificent liar. But it sounded good, and Rule's scales flattened against his body, which meant she had his attention. In the front row, a small avian creature with pale blue feathers pressed tight against her body was watching Lena with enormous golden eyes that were cataloging every movement, every breath, every micro-expression. This was Cadet Kessa Jal, and she was Telhari, and her people were a prey species that had survived 10,000 years of evolution by being smarter and more observant than anything that wanted to eat them. And right now every nerve in her body was screaming that this human was dangerous. Not because of the teeth, and not because of the way she moved, and not because of the direct eye contact that would be considered a death threat on 9 different worlds. It was because the human was completely relaxed. Kessa had studied predators her entire life, and predators were only completely relaxed when they were so confident in their ability to kill everything in the room that they did not even need to think about it. She made a mental note to begin a research file. Over the next 3 days, Lena did things that made no sense to any of them. She touched them on the shoulders when she spoke to them, and among Vraxi, This was a claim of ownership, and among Talhari, it was an intimate gesture reserved for mates. And among Myrelians, it meant absolutely nothing, but was still startling, because Myrelians were very small, and Lena's hand covered Pip's entire back. She made direct eye contact with everyone constantly, which was a threat display on most worlds. She smiled all the time, which was baring her teeth, which was what you did right before you bit someone, and she never stopped moving. On the third day, Kessa timed her, and Lena was active for 16 hours before she finally sat down. And even then she was still talking, and still making plans, and still sketching diagrams of the wilderness survival course she had planned for them. Kessa looked at her own notes, and wrote a single line that she would later expand into a full chapter of her thesis. The human does not appear to have an off switch. On the evening of the third day, Lena announced the survival exercise, and the groans were loud enough to hear through the hall. Cross-species teams, she said cheerfully. You will be assigned partners, and you will work together, and you will keep each other alive. And you will learn that the person sitting across that gap from you is not your enemy, and is not your prey, and is not your predator, but is your teammate. She looked at all of them, and her eyes were warm, and her voice was steady, and she said, No, you are afraid of each other, and that is fine, because fear is where courage starts. Nobody knew what to say to that. Later that night, Lena walked through the station's upper concourse, and she stopped when she saw a shape in the courtyard below. It was a child. It was enormous. It was a Gorath cub, and even at 4 years old he was the size of a small bear, with 6 limbs and dark fur, and jaws that could bite through metal. And he was sitting alone, in the middle of a wide, empty space, batting a piece of scrap hull plating back and forth between his front paws. Around the edges of the courtyard, other species walked in wide arcs, giving the cub a distance that was less about respect and more about survival. No one spoke to him, and no one looked at him, and no one stopped. He was alone, the way only the most dangerous things in the universe are alone. Lena leaned on the railing and watched him, and something in her chest that she could not name, and did not try to name, settled into a quiet, steady ache. Hey, little guy, she whispered to no one. The cub batted his scrap metal toy, and it skidded across the floor, and he chased it, and his tail wagged once before he remembered that no one was watching and no one cared. But someone was watching, and she cared very much. The Diodome was a world inside a station, and it stretched out beneath a false sky that shifted from blue to gold to dark, depending on the time cycle, and the trees were real, and the rivers were real, and the wind was mostly real, except when the ventilation systems made it smell faintly of recycled air. Lena stood at the entrance with her cohort behind her, and she looked at the wilderness ahead of them, and she breathed in deep, and she smiled. 2 days, she said. Your teams have food for 1 day, and tools for half a day, and your brains for the whole time. So use them. Kessa stood beside Rule and a tiny Morellian engineer named Pip, who was roughly the size of a human housecat and had 6 nimble fingers on each hand, and enormous dark eyes that made him look permanently startled, which, to be fair, he usually was. Their team also had Lena as their observer, which meant she would walk with them and watch them and teach them, but she would not save them from their own bad decisions. This became clear within the first 2 hours when Rule insisted on leading them east because he said he could smell water, and Lena said nothing, and Kessa said nothing, because questioning of Raxi Male in front of others was a social violation. And Pip said nothing because Pip was riding on Kessa's shoulder and had fallen asleep. Rule led them straight into a swamp. He stood knee-deep in dark water with his scales flushing a deep embarrassed red, and he looked at Lena, who was standing on dry ground at the edge of the swamp, with her arms crossed, and a look on her face that was not quite a smile, but was definitely not sympathy. The water is that way, she said, pointing in the exact opposite direction that Rule had led them. I could tell, because the moss on the trees grows thicker on the side facing moisture, and the ground slopes down to the west, not the east. Why did you not say something? Rule hissed. Because you did not ask, Lena said. Because you will remember this lesson a lot longer than you would remember a lecture. Rule climbed out of the swamp, and he did not speak for an hour. And when he finally did speak, it was to ask Kessa quietly if she had noticed the moss. And Kessa, who had noticed the moss, and had said nothing because she was afraid to contradict him, admitted that she had. Then why did you not say something? Rule asked. Because I was afraid of you, Kessa said. They looked at each other, and something shifted between them. And it was small, and it was fragile, but it was real. By the 6th hour of walking, the cadets were exhausted. Vraxi were built for short explosive bursts of speed, and Rule's legs were burning, and his breathing was heavy, and he kept stopping to rest against trees. Kessa was a flyer, not a walker, and her legs ached in ways she had never experienced, and her feathers were damp with sweat. Pip had given up walking entirely, and was being carried in a vehicle, makeshift sling, that Lena had fashioned from a strip of fabric in approximately 4 seconds. And Lena was still walking. She was still talking. She was still pointing out edible plants, and animal tracks, and water sources, and defensible positions, and she had not slowed down, and she had not stopped, and she showed no signs of doing either of those things. By the 10th hour, Rule could not walk anymore, and he sat down heavily against a rock, and his legs trembled, and he said, "How are you still moving?" Lena crouched next to him, and she said, "My species evolved on a planet where we were not the fastest, and we were not the strongest, and we did not have claws, or scales, or venom, or armor, and the animals that wanted to eat us were better than us in almost every way." She paused, and then she said, "So we learned to just keep going, and the things that were faster than us would sprint ahead, and then they would have to rest, and we would catch up, and they would sprint again, and rest again, and we would catch up again, and we would do this for hours and sometimes days, until the thing we were chasing simply could not run anymore, and it would collapse, and we would walk up to it calm and steady, and that would be the end." The forest was very quiet. Rahul stared at her, and his amber eyes were wide, and his scales had flattened completely against his body, which was the Vraxi equivalent of a human's hair standing on end. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that your species hunted by simply refusing to stop?" "Yes," Lena said. "That is horrifying," Rahul said. "Thank you," Lena said. Kessa wrote in her field notes that night by the light of a small fire that Lena had built, and her entry was brief and shaky. "I have made a mistake in my initial assessment of humans as persistence predators, and I need to correct this, because persistence predator implies that the persistence is only used for hunting, but I have watched this human for 10 hours, and the persistence is used for everything, and it is not a hunting strategy. It is the fundamental nature of the species, and they apply it to walking, and talking, and teaching, and caring, and they simply do not stop. And I am beginning to understand why the galaxy should be paying much more attention." That night, Lena told stories around the fire, and the cadets listened, and Pip fell asleep in the warmth of Kessa's feathers, and Rule sat closer to the group than he ever had before. On the 2nd day, the storm came. It was supposed to be a gentle weather cycle, but something in the biodome systems malfunctioned, and the wind picked up hard, and the temperature dropped fast, and rain lashed through the trees in sheets. Lena moved like something had switched on inside her, and she had a shelter built from branches and emergency sheeting in minutes. And the cadets huddled inside and watched her work, and they were beginning to understand that this small, soft creature without claws or scales was perhaps the most competent being they had ever met. Then the distress signal came through on the comm, and it was broken and patchy, but Lena caught the coordinates, and her face changed. "Stay here," she said, and her voice was different now, and it was not warm, and it was not friendly, and it was the voice of something that had spent 2 million years refusing to die. "Stay together, and do not move." She took her utility knife, and she walked into the storm. Kessa watched her go, and the rain swallowed her in seconds, and the wind howled, and the trees bent, and the human disappeared into the dark like she had been born there. Kessa looked at Rule, and Rule looked at Kessa, and Pip woke up and looked at both of them. "We are going after her," Kessa said, and it was not a question. "That is a terrible idea," Rule said. "Yes," Kessa said. "I am in," Rule said, and the three of them stepped out into the storm, because their instructor had taught them something without ever saying it out loud. She had taught them that you do not leave your people behind. Not ever. Not even when you are afraid. Especially when you are afraid. Lena found the ravine by following the sound. It was not a distress beacon after all. Or rather, the beacon was automated and had been triggered by impact when something heavy had fallen and hit the emergency sensor on the way down. That something was not a cadet. It was a Gorath cub. Tavrik was crouched on a narrow rock ledge about halfway down the ravine, and the wind was tearing at his dark fur, and his 6 legs were pressed flat against the stone, and his enormous golden eyes were wide with a fear that made him look less like the child of the galaxy's most terrifying apex predator, and more like what he actually was, a scared little kid who had gotten himself stuck. Lena stood at the top of the ravine, and the rain pounded against her back, and she looked down at the cub, and she did the math in her head. He weighed at least 90 kilograms even at his age, and his claws could tear through hull plating, and his jaws could crush bone like dry wood. He was frightened, and a frightened animal was a dangerous animal, and a frightened Gorath was a dangerous everything. Any sane person would call for help and wait at a safe distance. Lena was many things, but she had never been accused of being sane. She started climbing down. The rock was wet and slippery, and the wind tried to pull her off the wall twice, and she dug her fingers into cracks in the stone, and she moved slowly and carefully, and she talked the entire time, because her grandmother had always said that the sound of a calm voice could gentle anything with ears. "Hey there," she called down to the cub. "My name is Lena, and I am coming to sit with you, and I need you to not bite me, because I only have 2 arms, and I am very attached to both of them." The cub heard her voice, and his head snapped up, and the low rumbling growl that came out of his chest was deep enough to vibrate the rock under Lena's hands. It was a warning. It said, "I am dangerous, and you should go away." Lena did not go away. She kept climbing down, and she kept talking, and her voice was steady and warm. And she said, "I know you are scared, and that is okay, because I am also scared, and this rock is very wet, and I am not as good at climbing as I used to be, but we are going to figure this out together." The cub growled again, and this time it was louder, and his lips pulled back to show teeth that were each as long as Lena's fingers and white as bone. Lena reached the ledge. She pulled herself up onto the flat stone, and the cub was 3 meters away from her, and he was pressed against the wall, and his growl was continuous now, and it filled the ravine like thunder. Lena sat down. She did not move toward him, and she did not move away from him, and she sat with her legs crossed and her hands open on her knees, and the rain ran down her face, and she looked at the cub, and she waited. The growling faltered, expected her to run, because everything ran, and he had expected her to freeze, because some things froze. But he had not expected her to sit down, and he did not know what to do with that. Lena started talking again, and her voice was low and easy, like she was sitting on a porch on a summer evening, instead of on a wet rock ledge next to a creature that could kill her with one swipe. "When I was a little girl, my grandmother lived in a house at the edge of the mountains, and one morning she opened her back door, and there was a bear on her porch, and the bear was eating her tomatoes, and my grandmother was very proud of her tomatoes." The cub's growl had faded to a low, uncertain rumble. "So my grandmother picked up her broom, and she walked right out onto that porch, and she looked that bear in the eye, and she said, "Those are my tomatoes." And the bear looked at this tiny old woman with a broom, and the bear decided that the tomatoes were not worth it, and it left. Made a sound that was not a growl, and it was higher and shorter, and it went up at the end, like a question. A chirp, a cub's curiosity sound. "My grandmother was not bigger than the bear," Lena said softly, "and she was not stronger than the bear, and she definitely could not outrun the bear, but she loved her tomatoes, and sometimes love makes you braver than anything." The cub chirped again, and he shifted on his legs, and he was still scared, but he was also confused and curious, and there was something about this small, soft creature's voice that made the fear smaller somehow. Lena held out her hand, palm up, and she waited. The wait lasted a long time, and the rain kept falling, and the wind kept blowing, and Lena's hand did not waver, and she did not pull it back, and she did not look away. The cub moved one step forward, and then another, and he stretched his neck out, and his nose was warm and wet against her palm, and he sniffed her, and his whiskers tickled. Lena held very still. Then Tavrik pressed his massive head into her hand, and she scratched behind his ear, the way she had seen in the Gorath behavioral files, and the cub made a sound like a rusty engine trying to start. It took an hour to get him to the top. Lena climbed first, and coaxed and encouraged, and talked the cub up one ledge at a time, and her arms were shaking, and her fingers were bleeding, and the rain had soaked through every layer of clothing she had, and she did not stop. When Tavrik finally pulled himself over the lip of the ravine, Lena was already there, and she grabbed handfuls of his fur and helped him, and the cub scrambled onto flat ground, and Lena collapsed onto her back in the mud, and she laughed. She laughed because she was alive, and the cub was alive, and because the adrenaline was hitting her all at once, and because somewhere in the back of her mind, her grandmother was probably laughing too. Tavrik looked at the human lying on the ground, and something in his young brain that was ancient and instinctive and joyful recognized what this was. This was play. He pounced. 90 kilograms of Gorath cub landed on Lena's chest and drove the air out of her lungs, and his paws were on her shoulders, and his face was centimeters from hers. And he opened his mouth, and he growled. It was a play growl, but it was still a Gorath growl, and it was loud enough to shake the ground. And hot breath washed over Lena's face, and she could see every single one of his teeth, and each one was perfect and white, and designed for killing. And Lena, pinned beneath a creature that outweighed her and could end her life in less than a second, looked that cub right in his golden eyes, and she growled back. It was a terrible growl, and it was a human growl, which meant it was more funny than frightening. And it came from somewhere deep in her chest, and it was ridiculous, and she knew it was ridiculous. Laughed. She laughed so hard her whole body shook, and Tavrik felt her shaking beneath him. And he did not understand laughter, but he understood joy, and he understood that this creature was not afraid of him, and for the first time in his short, lonely life, something had chosen to stay. He purred. The sound was deep and fast, and it resonated through Lena's ribs and into the ground beneath her, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. At the edge of the tree line, 3 figures stood frozen in the rain. Kessa's feathers were clamped so tight against her body that she looked half her normal size, and her golden eyes were enormous. Ruel's legs had locked, and his scales had gone pale, which was the Vraxi equivalent of turning white as a sheet. Pip had fainted, and was lying face down in the mud. They had arrived just in time to see their instructor get pounced on by a Gorath cub, and they had watched the cub growl in her face. Instinct in every one of their bodies had screamed that they were about to witness a death. And then she had growled back, and then she had laughed. And then the most dangerous child in the known galaxy had started purring like he had found something he had been looking for his entire life. Kessa stood in the rain, and the water ran down her feathers, and she watched her human instructor lying in the mud, laughing with a Gorath cub purring on her chest. And she understood something that she would spend the rest of her career trying to explain to the galaxy. Humans were not misclassified. They were not a Class 3 predator, or a Class 5 predator, or any class at all. They were the species that heard a monster growl and growled back, not from dominance and not from aggression, but from something that Kessa did not have a word for in her language. The closest she could come was a concept that translated roughly to the stubbornness of love. It would make an excellent thesis title. The story spread through Station Helix 9 the way fire spreads through dry grass, which is to say, completely and unstoppably and with a great deal of heat. Cadet Gossip was the most powerful communication network in the galaxy, and it was faster than light-speed transmissions, and more reliable than military encryption, and absolutely impossible to contain. By the morning after the ravine incident, every cadet on the station had heard some version of what happened, and the versions were getting more dramatic by the hour. The Telhari cadets said the human had wrestled a Gorath cub into submission with her bare hands. The Vraxi cadets said the human had roared so loud that the cub had submitted out of shock. The Morellians, who were generally the most accurate because they were too small to exaggerate, said the human had simply sat next to a frightened child and refused to leave. And somehow that was more impressive than all the other versions combined. The attention exhausting. He is a kid, she told Kessa for the 4th time that day while they were cleaning gear in the equipment room. He was scared, and he was stuck, and I sat with him, and that is the whole story. Kessa tilted her head, which was a Telhari gesture of deep skepticism, and she said, "You climbed into a ravine with no safety equipment to sit next to a Gorath cub who was actively threatening you." "He was not threatening me, he was scared." His growl registered on the biodome's seismic sensors. Lena paused, and then she shrugged and said, "Kids are loud." Kessa added this to her growing file of evidence that humans were fundamentally incapable of recognizing their own absurdity. But something had changed in the cohort, and everyone could feel it. The gap in the training hall was smaller. Not gone, but smaller, and the predator species and the prey species were sitting closer together, and they were talking more. Differently. Rule was the most visible change. He stopped puffing his neck frills in the corridors, and he stopped making dominant sounds when he entered a room. And he stopped trying to make himself look bigger and more dangerous than he was. One evening, he found Lena alone in the training hall, running through hand-to-hand combat forms, and he stood in the doorway for a long time before he spoke. "Sergeant Vasquez." Lena stopped mid-form and looked at him, and she said, "Rule, I need to tell you something," he said, and his scales were shifting colors in the pattern that meant shame and anxiety, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Lena sat down on the training mat, and she patted the space next to her, and Rule sat, and he was silent for a while. "My clan sent me here to represent Vraxi's strength," he said. "They told me I must never show weakness, and I must establish dominance over the other species, and I must make them respect the Vraxi strength." Vraxi name. He paused, and his claws clicked against the floor. "I have been performing strength for months, and I am tired, and I am not strong, and I was not strong in the swamp, and I was not strong when I froze at the ravine, and I have been lying to everyone, including myself." Lena looked at him, and her eyes were kind, and she said, "Rule, do you want to know something about humans?" "Yes. Every single human soldier I have ever served with was terrified, and every single one of them wanted to run, and every single one of them stayed anyway. And that is not because they were pretending to be brave, and it is not because they were too stupid to be afraid." She looked at him steadily and she said, "Brave does not mean you are not scared, Rule, and it never has, and it never will. And brave means you are scared and you sit down on the ledge anyway." Rule was quiet for a long time, and then he made a sound that Lena had never heard from a Vraxi before. Was soft and low, and it wavered, and it was the sound of someone letting go of something heavy that they had been carrying for far too long. Meanwhile, Kessa had become the station's unofficial human expert. Other cadets found her in the library, and in the corridors, and in the meal hall, and they asked her questions with the desperate intensity of people who had just discovered that the universe was stranger than they thought. Is it true they can run for days? Documented cases suggest they can maintain movement for over 24 hours, yes. Is it true they bond with anything? I have seen Sergeant Vasquez talk to a broken coffee machine for 6 minutes, and then fix it, while apologizing for being rough with it. So yes. Is it true they think Gorath cubs are cute? Kessa paused at this one, and she considered her answer carefully. And she said, "They appear to find almost everything cute, and I believe this may be their most terrifying trait." Then the summons came. Warden Sela of the Gorath Diplomatic Corps formally requested a meeting with Sergeant Lena Vasquez aboard the Gorath warship Unbroken Silence, and the cadets treated this news the way they would treat news of an incoming asteroid. "A formal Gorath summons," Pip squeaked from his usual perch on Kessa's shoulder. "That is either a commendation or a challenge to ritual combat." "It is a meeting, Pip," Lena said. "Those are the same thing to Goraths," Pip said. Lena boarded the Unbroken Silence alone, and the warship was enormous, and the corridors were built for creatures 3 times her size, and her footsteps echoed in the vast metal hallways, and she felt like a child walking through a cathedral. Gorath warriors lined the corridor, and each one was massive and armored, and watching her with eyes that burned like embers. And Lena nodded to each one as she passed, and 2 of them nodded back, and looked surprised at themselves for doing it. The chamber at the heart of the ship was warm and dimly lit, and it smelled like earth and stone, and something old and alive. Warden Sela sat in the center of the room, and she was the largest living thing Lena had ever seen. And her fur was silver dark, and her 6 limbs were folded beneath her, and her eyes were deep amber, and ancient, and full of something that Lena did not expect to find there. Sadness. "Sit," Sela said, and her voice was deep and resonant, and it filled the room like distant thunder. Lena sat on the floor, because the Gorath chairs were the size of vehicles, and she crossed her legs, and she looked up at the warden, and she waited. "You saved my son," Sela said. "I sat with your son," Lena said. "He saved himself." Sela made a sound that might have been a laugh if mountains could laugh. "You are a strange species," the warden said. "Small and soft and fragile and strange." Said. Sela was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke, and the words came slowly as though she had been carrying them for a very long time. "The Gorath are the apex species of this galaxy, and we have been the apex species for 10,000 years. And in that time, we have conquered worlds, and built empires, and ended wars with our presence alone, and we are feared by every species that has ever looked upon us." She paused. "And we are lonely." The word hung in the warm air between them. "My son has never had a playmate," Sela said. "No child of another species will come near him, and their parents pull them away, and the other children scream and run, and Tavrik does not understand why, because he is a child and he wants to play, and he does not know that the galaxy looks at him and sees a monster." Lena's throat was tight, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be enough. "We have tried everything," Sela continued. "Programs and educational exchanges and diplomatic overtures, and we even considered genetic modification to make our children smaller and less frightening, and none of it has worked because the fear is too deep and too old." The warden leaned forward, and her enormous eyes fixed on Lena, and she asked the question that had haunted the Gorath since the day they first encountered humanity. "Why are you not afraid of us?" Lena thought about it, and she thought about the ravine, and the rain, and the growl and the purr, and she thought about her grandmother and the bear, and the tomatoes. "We are afraid," she said. "We are afraid of everything, honestly. Because we grew up on a world that was trying to kill us every single day, and the oceans tried to drown us, and the weather tried to freeze us, and the animals tried to eat us, and the ground itself tried to shake us apart. She looked up at the most powerful creature in the galaxy, and she said, "So we learned to be afraid and do things anyway." And somewhere along the way we learned that the things that scare us the most are usually the things most worth sitting next to. The chamber was silent. Sayla looked at this small human on the floor, and she said, "My people have a word that is sacred to us, and the word is Torvon, and it means one who stands beside. And we give it to the bravest of our warriors, and in 10,000 years of Gorath history we have never given it to an outsider." She did not say what she would do with this word, but it hung between them like a promise. And back at the academy, Tavrik had started showing up at training sessions, and he would sit at the edge of the field and watch. And the cadets were terrified at first, but within 3 days, Pip was scratching him behind the ears, and Rule was playing tug-of-war with him using a cargo strap. And Kessa was taking notes and smiling in a way that Telhari only smiled when they felt safe. And she felt safe. First time on this station, surrounded by predators and prey, and a Gorath cub who purred when you scratched his ears, she felt safe. Because the human had taught them all the same lesson without ever saying it. The lesson was this: you cannot make the galaxy less frightening, but you can sit down next to the scary thing and stay. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. 6 months changed everything. The cohort that had once sat in 2 halves with a canyon of fear between them now moved like a single living thing, and they were fast, and they were smart, and they trusted each other in ways that no integration cohort in the Academy's history had ever achieved. Kessa had become a field leader who could read a battlefield the way her ancestors read the wind, and she saw threats before they arrived, and opportunities before they appeared. And she gave orders with a calm, steady confidence that made even the predator species cadets listen without question. Rule had become the kind of soldier his clan had wanted him to be, but not in the way they expected. And he was not loud, and he was not aggressive, and he did not posture, and instead he was steady and quiet. And when things went wrong, he was the one who stepped forward and said, "I will go." Pip had invented 3 new pieces of field equipment, including a communication relay that could be assembled from scrap in under 12 minutes, and a water purification tablet that worked on 17 different biochemistries, and a very small explosive device that he was not supposed to have built, but that Lena pretended not to know about. They were the top-performing cohort in the academy, and the graduation trials were tomorrow. And every military leader and diplomat and journalist in the Galactic Union would be watching. The graduation trial was legendary, and it was designed to be impossible. A simulated colony under siege, with civilians to rescue, and defensive positions to hold, and wounded to treat, and a hostile faction to negotiate with, and a dozen other objectives that no cohort had ever completed in the exercise's 40-year history. Lena gathered her cadets the night before, and they sat in a circle in the training hall, and Tavrik lay in the middle of them like an enormous furry table, and his tail thumped against the floor every time someone touched him. "Tomorrow is going to be hard," Lena said, "and things are going to go wrong because things always go wrong, and the plan will not survive first contact with the scenario, because plans never do." She looked at each of them, and her gaze was warm and fierce and proud. "But you are ready, and I know you are ready because I have watched you become something that this academy has never seen before. And you are not a group of species working together, and you are a team." Rule's scales shimmered, and he said, "What if we fail?" "Then you fail together," Lena said, "and that is still worth more than succeeding alone." Tavrik purred, and the vibration traveled through the floor and into all of them like a heartbeat. The trial began at dawn. The biodome had been reconfigured into a war zone, with collapsed buildings and simulated fires, and panicking civilian actors. And the hostile faction was played by senior cadets, who were very good at being hostile. Lena's cohort hit the ground running, Kessa took the high position because her prey species' senses could detect things that no predator would notice. And within 30 seconds, she had identified the ambush that 3 previous cohorts had walked directly into. Contact, north behind the fallen structure, and 4 hostiles in elevated positions, and they are expecting us to come through the main avenue, she called through the comm. Alternate route, Rule responded immediately, and he was already moving, and his team followed, and they flanked the ambush and neutralized it in 90 seconds. Pip hacked into the scenario's communication network from a maintenance panel using a piece of wire and his own terrifying genius. And suddenly the cohort had information that no team was supposed to have, and they used it brilliantly. The civilian rescue was textbook, and the medical triage was flawless. And when the scenario threw its final challenge at them, which was a simulated cave-in, trapping civilians in a collapsing structure, it was Rule who went in. He looked at the dark, unstable entrance, and his scales went pale, and his legs trembled, and he was afraid. He went in anyway. He braced a falling beam with his body, and his scales cracked under the weight, and he roared in pain, and he held it long enough for every single simulated civilian to be pulled to safety. And when he finally let go and staggered out, his scales were fractured along his left side, and he was bleeding, and he was smiling. The judges were stunned. For the first time in 40 years, a cohort had completed every objective. The viewing gallery erupted, and dignitaries from 100 worlds were on their feet, and the sound of cheering and clicking and humming and singing filled the biodome. And Lita stood with her arms crossed, watching her cadets celebrate, and her eyes were bright and wet, and she was so proud it hurt. And then the world broke. Sound came first, and it was a deep structural groan that did not belong to the simulation, and it came from above, and it came from the bones of the station itself. The viewing gallery buckled. A section of seating cracked and tilted, and dignitaries screamed and scrambled, and a massive piece of structural framing tore free and fell toward the biodome floor, directly above a cluster of junior cadets from other cohorts who had been watching from a lower observation platform. They were children, and they could not move fast enough. Lena was running before the first piece of debris hit the ground. She did not think about it, and she did not calculate the odds, and she did not weigh the risks, because there were children in danger and she was a human, and humans run toward the screaming. Kessa, evacuate west, she shouted. Rule east support column, Pip, get me emergency systems now. And they followed. They did not hesitate, and they did not freeze, and they were afraid, and they ran toward the danger anyway, because that was what she had taught them, and that was what she had shown them, and that was who they had become. Kessa coordinated the evacuation with a voice like a blade cutting through the chaos, and she guided dozens of panicking cadets toward the emergency exits, and she was a prey species who was supposed to run from danger, and she ran toward it instead. Rule threw himself against a collapsing support column, and he braced it with his already broken body, and his cracked scales screamed and his muscles burned, and he held it because people were behind him, and he would not let it fall. Pip jacked into the station's emergency grid and rerouted power to the structural integrity fields and bought them precious seconds. And from the Gorath diplomatic box, high above the biodome, Tavrik saw what was happening. He was no longer a small cub. 6 months of growth had made him massive and powerful, were thick under his dark fur, and his eyes burned gold, and he saw the debris falling toward the children below, and he did not think. He leaped. A Gorath in motion is a force of nature, and Tavrik cleared the railing and dropped into the biodome like a meteor, and he landed over the cluster of junior cadets, and he covered them with his body, and the debris rained down on his back, and each impact was a hammer blow. And he felt his fur tear, and his skin bruise, and one piece of metal cut a gash along his flank. And he roared. Not a play growl, and not a frightened cub's warning, but the full roar of a young Gorath protecting those he had claimed as his own. And the sound shook the biodome, and shook the station, and shook something deep in the hearts of every being who heard it. Lena reached him. She was bleeding from a cut above her eye, and her uniform was torn, and she was breathing hard, and she pushed through the falling dust and the settling debris, and she found Tavrik crouched over a dozen trembling cadets, and he was hurt and scared and surrounded by screaming aliens, and his eyes found hers. He growled. It was the same growl from the ravine, and it was not a threat, and it was not anger, and it was a plea, and it said, "I am scared, and please do not leave." Lena put her hand on his massive head, and she pressed her forehead against his, and she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Good boy, and I am right here, and we are not going anywhere." He purred. The debris settled, and the dust cleared, and the cadets beneath him were alive, and all of them were alive, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence the galaxy had ever known. The footage was broadcast across every network in the Galactic Union that night. A small human woman standing in the rubble with her hand on the head of a young Gorath, and both of them bleeding, and both of them unbroken, and both of them refusing to leave. It became the most viewed image in galactic history. 3 days later, the Galactic Union Assembly convened in full session, and Warden Sayla stood before the representatives of 1,000 worlds, and her voice filled the chamber like the sound of ancient mountains. 10,000 years ago, my people created a word for the bravest among us, and the word is Torvon, and it means one who stands beside, and it has been given to our greatest warriors, and our most honored defenders, and it has never been given to someone who was not Gorath. She paused, and the silence was absolute. Today, that changes. Sergeant Lena Vasquez stood before the assembly in a borrowed uniform, because her own had been destroyed in the collapse, and the cut above her eye had been sealed, but it would scar. And she stood straight, and she stood steady, and she was afraid, because this was terrifying, and she stood anyway. "Lena Vasquez," Sayla said, "Torvon and one who stands beside, and first of her kind, and you are claimed by the Gorath as one of our own." The Gorath delegation began to purr. It was a deep, resonant sound that built and grew, and filled the chamber like the heartbeat of a world. And one by one, the other species joined. The Vraxi hummed a warrior's recognition. The Telhari sang a note so pure and high that it brought tears to the eyes of every species that had tear ducts. The Morellians clicked in rapid synchronized rhythm. And the humans did what humans do. They clapped, and they cheered, and several of them cried, and they were loud and messy and emotional, and absolutely perfectly human. Kessa published her thesis 1 month later, and it was titled Persistence Bonding: How Humans Became the Galaxy's Apex Companions, and it became required reading at every military academy in the Galactic Union. The final line of the thesis read, "Humans do not sit at the top of the food chain, but rather they sit beside whatever is at the top of the food chain, and they bring snacks, and they stay, and this I believe is why the galaxy will never be the same." And on a training field on Station Helix 9, on a morning that smelled like recycled air and possibility, Sergeant Lena Vasquez stood before a new cohort of cadets, with Tavrik beside her because he had been officially designated as the Academy's first cross-species integration aide, which was a title that Warden Sayla had invented specifically so her son could stay with the human who had changed his life. A new cadet trembled in the front row and stared up at the enormous Gorath and the small, scarred human standing beside him. And the cadet said, "How can you stand so close to that thing?" Lena grinned, and it was all teeth, and it was all warmth, and she leaned in and she said, "You want to know a secret?" The cadet nodded. "He gives the best hugs in the galaxy." Tavrik looked at the trembling cadet, and his golden eyes were bright and playful. Mouth, and he growled. The cadet flinched. Lena growled back. She laughed. Tavrik purred. And somewhere across the vast and spinning galaxy, the universe, got a little less afraid.